The morning I discovered my name had been removed from my husband's will, I was standing in our kitchen in my bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I read a letter I was never supposed to see. The number at the top of the document was $560,000, and my name appeared nowhere in it. I set the cup down on the marble counter very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are shaking but you refuse to let anyone see. My name is Raven. I'm 43 years old, and what Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that his own attorney had already found the page that would unravel everything. That letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, 3 weeks ago. It was addressed to Marcus Whitmore, my husband of 14 years, but it had been tucked inside a manila envelope with several other documents he'd left on the kitchen counter the night before. I don't believe in snooping. I want to say that plainly. But when an unsealed envelope with your home address on it slides open because the adhesive has dried out, and a document marked Last Will and Testament slips out with it, you read it. You read it with the kind of focused clarity that descends on you when the body understands something before the mind is willing to. I read it twice. Then I folded it exactly as I'd found it, slid it back into the envelope, and finished making breakfast. What Marcus didn't know was that while he sat at that kitchen table eating scrambled eggs and checking his phone, I had already made 3 decisions. What they didn't know was that his own estate attorney had flagged something, 1 page, tucked into a file from 14 years earlier, that Marcus had apparently forgotten existed. But before I tell you what happened in that attorney's office 12 days later, you need to come back with me to the beginning. You need to understand who Marcus was before he became the man who sat across from me that October morning like nothing had changed. And you need to understand what I built quietly, over 14 years, while everyone assumed I was simply standing beside him. Before I go further, if this story is already making your chest tighten in a way that feels familiar, take a moment to subscribe. Only if this is landing with you, only if you feel something real. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's on the other side of the screen. Now let me take you back to where this actually started. I met Marcus Whitmore in the fall of 2009 at a charity fundraiser in downtown Chicago. I was 29 years old, 3 years into my career as a forensic accountant at a mid-sized firm, and I had been invited by a colleague who thought I needed to get out of the office more. She was right about that, at least. Marcus was 38 at the time, charming in the way that men with money and manners learn to be charming, effortlessly, without apparent effort, the way a magician makes you forget there's a trick. He was the kind of man who remembered your coffee order on the second date, who sent flowers without an occasion, who told you in those early months that you were the most interesting woman he had ever met. I won't pretend I wasn't moved by that. I was. I was 29 and I was human, and I believed him completely. What I did not fully understand then was that Marcus came with an architecture. His world had structures and hierarchies that predated me by decades, and at the center of that architecture was his mother, Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had spent 71 years perfecting the art of controlling outcomes while appearing merely to observe them. Eleanor lived in a Tudor-style home in Evanston, 22 miles from our apartment, and she visited exactly as often as Marcus allowed, which was always more often than I had agreed to. She never raised her voice. She never said anything outright cruel. She simply made small, precise adjustments to plans, to expectations, to how Marcus perceived things, the way a surgeon adjusts the angle of a scalpel by a single millimeter to change everything downstream. It was my grandmother, Adele, who warned me. Not in the way that you might expect. No dramatic speech, no sitting me down. She said it in passing, the summer before Marcus and I got married, while we were shelling peas on her porch in Minnesota, in the particular amber light of a July evening. She said, "Raven, be careful of the people who are kind to your face and generous with what was never theirs to give." I remember looking at her, not entirely sure who she meant. She didn't explain. She just handed me another handful of peas. I didn't understand what she was telling me. Not for another 11 years. We married in June of 2010, on a Saturday when the sky over Lake Michigan was the particular shade of pale blue that makes you feel like the world is offering you something. I was 30. Marcus was 39. We had 87 guests. The wedding was beautiful. Eleanor sat in the front row in a dove-gray dress and smiled every time anyone looked at her. I told myself, watching her that day, that I was being uncharitable, that the discomfort I felt around her was my own insecurity. I made a quiet promise to myself to try harder, to extend more grace, to give the relationship time to breathe. I kept that promise for 11 years. Eleanor never acknowledged it. What those 11 years looked like, from the outside, was a functional and even enviable marriage. Marcus ran a commercial real estate development firm. I continued working as a forensic accountant, eventually as a senior investigator, and by year 6 of our marriage, I had built a caseload that earned considerably more than Marcus ever acknowledged. He was not a man who spoke openly about money. Not mine specifically. His, he discussed freely. Mine existed in a kind of polite silence. When couples at dinner parties asked what I did, Marcus would say, "Raven works in finance," and move on. I let it go. I told myself it was a small thing. The will was not a small thing. Marcus had developed a heart condition in the spring of 2020. Nothing immediately life-threatening, his cardiologist was careful to say, but serious enough to require monitoring, medication, and a sober reckoning with the future. It was after that diagnosis that he began meeting regularly with an estate attorney named Gerald Foss, an older man Marcus had known through business for more than 20 years. I was present for the first 2 meetings. Then, without discussion, I wasn't. In September of 2021, during a long weekend that Marcus told me he was spending golfing in Wisconsin with 2 colleagues, I now know he met with Foss privately and amended his will. He had it notarized on September 18, 2021, at 2:14 in the afternoon. His estate, valued then at approximately $560,000 across accounts, investments, and property, was restructured to flow entirely to a family trust managed by Eleanor and his brother, Douglas. My name, which had appeared in the previous version, was gone. The amendment cited no reason. It required none, legally. He simply removed me. I didn't know any of this until that October Tuesday 3 weeks ago, when the document slid out of its envelope, and I stood in my kitchen with cold coffee and a very clear mind. I didn't cry that morning. I made a different decision. I went to work. I sat at my desk for 9 hours. I completed 2 reports. At 6:47 p.m., I called an attorney I had worked alongside on a case 3 years prior, a woman named Claire Johansson, who specialized in marital and estate law, and who had, on more than one occasion, said to me directly, "Raven, if you ever need me, you call." I called. She answered on the second ring. If you've ever stood in a moment where something you half suspected for years finally became undeniable, type the word clarity in the comments. I read every single one. I will see your name. What Claire told me in that first phone call set into motion something I had not anticipated. She asked me several questions about the timeline, about my own financial contributions to our assets over the marriage, about whether I had documentation. I had documentation. 14 years of meticulous records, because I am a forensic accountant and documentation is not something I approach casually. I had joint tax returns. I had records of a $94,000 down payment on our home that had come from an inheritance my grandmother Adele had left me. I had records of a $38,500 contribution I had made to Marcus's business during a cash flow crisis in 2014, a contribution he had called a loan between us and never repaid. I had bank statements spanning 168 months. Claire listened without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "I need to make a call to Gerald Foss's office tomorrow morning." I asked her why. She said, "Because I want to see the full file. All of it." including what was filed before the amendment. I need to pause here for one moment. If you can feel what I was feeling in that phone call, that particular calm that arrives when you stop hoping things will improve on their own and realize you have been prepared for this moment longer than you knew, type "I understand" in the comments. Because what happened next is what everything had been leading toward. Gerald Foss had been Marcus's attorney for 22 years. He was also, it turned out, a meticulous man who kept exceptionally complete files. When Claire contacted his office, she requested the full estate documentation history. Foss's paralegal sent it over on a Thursday afternoon. Claire called me at 8:43 p.m. that night. Her voice was measured, professional, and underneath it, I know this woman well enough now to hear the difference. There was something that might have been quiet satisfaction. "There's a page in the original will," she said, "filed in March of 2011, 4 months after your marriage. Marcus had it drawn up with Foss directly." She paused. "It's a clause, Raven, a spousal contribution protection clause. It states explicitly that any assets directly contributed by you during the marriage, documented contributions, are to be recognized and protected regardless of subsequent amendments, unless both parties sign a formal dissolution agreement removing it." The room was very still. I was sitting at my desk with one lamp on, and I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen down the hall. "Did Marcus sign a dissolution agreement?" I asked. "No," Claire said. "He didn't. There's no record that he or his attorney even flagged this clause when the amendment was filed in 2021. It appears it was simply overlooked. Foss's paralegal confirmed the page is original and notarized. It was never revoked. Some doors don't close, they seal. The meeting happened on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after I found the document. Marcus did not know I had retained Claire. He did not know what had been found. He arrived at Foss's office at 9 a.m., believing it was a routine annual estate review, a meeting Foss had scheduled on the pretext of a regulatory update. Eleanor was present, because Eleanor was always present when something might go her way. She wore a cream blouse and a small pearl pendant. She smelled faintly of expensive powder. She smiled at me when I walked in and said, "Raven, darling, I didn't know you'd be joining us," in the tone she used for things she found unfortunate. I sat down across from Marcus. Claire sat beside me. Foss sat at the head of the table, and his expression, the careful neutrality of a man who knows what is in a file, told me that he had understood since Claire's call exactly what this meeting was. Marcus looked at me and then at Claire, and something moved across his face. Not guilt, not yet. Confusion first. Then the beginning of unease. I let Claire speak first. She was brief and precise. She laid the original will page, the 2011 clause, and my 14 years of documented financial contributions on the table in a single organized stack. She stated the total of documented marital contributions attributable to me: $147,300 in verifiable direct contributions, not including the proportional valuation of labor and income invested into shared assets. She noted the absence of any dissolution agreement. She said what this meant for the amendment Marcus had filed in September 2021 and what it meant for the $560,000 estate. Eleanor's hands, folded on the table, went very still. Marcus said, "That clause. Foss, you didn't tell me." And Gerald Foss, who had practiced law for 39 years and was clearly tired, said quietly, "The clause was in the original filing, Marcus. It was the client's responsibility to request its removal." The color that left Marcus's face in that moment I will not forget. It didn't drain all at once. It went slowly, the way light goes out of a room when the sun moves behind a cloud. Eleanor opened her mouth and then closed it. For perhaps the first time in the 11 years I had known her, she had nothing to adjust. I spoke then. I had prepared what I wanted to say carefully, not with anger. Anger would have been too much of a gift to give them. I said it in the same tone I use when I present financial findings to a jury. I built a life beside you, Marcus. I contributed to every asset in this estate. I documented all of it, not because I expected this day, but because documentation is simply what I do. I want what was always mine, nothing more. My grandmother Adele had told me to be careful of people who were generous with what was never theirs to give. What she had also told me, though it took 11 years to understand it, was the corollary. What is truly yours cannot be given away by someone who doesn't own it. The aftermath moved quickly. Within 6 days, Claire had filed the formal challenge. Within 3 weeks, Marcus's revised estate planning was already being restructured with legal oversight, because Gerald Foss, who was far more interested in his professional legacy than in Marcus Whitmore's convenience, advised him clearly and without softening that the original clause was binding. The $94,000 Adele inheritance investment was formally recognized. The $38,500 business contribution was documented as an outstanding debt. The protected portion of the estate attributable to me was established in writing. Eleanor called me on a Thursday evening, 9 days after the meeting. It was the first time she had ever called me directly in all 14 years. She said she wanted to speak about the situation. I told her that I had said what I had to say in the presence of attorneys, and that I had nothing further to add. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I never thought you would go this far." I told her gently that I had not gone anywhere. I had simply stayed exactly where I had always been, right there, with every receipt. 3 weeks have passed since that Wednesday morning in Foss's office. Marcus and I are in the process of a formal separation. My attorney handles the communication. I am not angry. I want you to believe that because I think it matters. The anger I might have carried has been replaced by something quieter and more durable. A kind of bedrock certainty that I know who I am and what I built, and that neither of those things was ever contingent on Marcus Whitmore's will. Last Saturday, I drove out to the cemetery in Minnesota, where my grandmother Adele is buried. The morning was cold, maybe 34 degrees, and the grass had gone that pale, exhausted gold that November grass goes in the northern Midwest. I stood beside her headstone for a while without saying anything. Then I said out loud, to no one in particular, "I understood, Grandma. I finally understood." What I know now, earned, not theorized, is this. The people who try to erase you from the record almost never account for the record you've been keeping yourself. They count on your silence. They count on the assumption that because you are calm, you are passive. They mistake restraint for weakness and watchfulness for acceptance. They're wrong about all of it. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever had your contributions quietly minimized by someone who depended on them, tell me in the comments. What did you do when you finally decided to stop being quiet? I read every one. If you know someone who needs to hear this today, pass it along. And if you're new to this channel, subscribe. There is another story waiting for you in the description, and I promise it is worth your time. Thank you for being here all the way to the end. I'll see you very soon.